You think you know what slavery looked like? You've seen the films, read the textbooks, and absorbed the shock of the Atlantic slave trade. You know the horrors of the Middle Passage, the plantations, the chains. You know that part of history well, because you were taught to. But what if I told you everything you learned was just the sanitized tip of the iceberg? What if there was another slave trade, longer, more systematic, and devastating on a civilizational level? One that didn't just enslave people, it rewrote their identities, erased their languages, and weaponized their children. One that turned bureaucratic paperwork into a machine of human destruction. And what if I told you this all happened in broad daylight, recorded in meticulous ledgers, documented in imperial archives, yet almost no one talks about it? Cut to a centuries-old register, names, birthplaces, heights, religion, and a blank space next to each one, new name assigned. This wasn't random brutality. This was the Devshirme, the blood tax. A state-sanctioned Ottoman policy where Christian boys were forcibly taken from their families, converted, trained, renamed, and turned into elite soldiers or administrators. Every few years, Ottoman officials swept through Balkan villages, selecting boys aged 7 to 20. They tested reflexes, measured height, checked teeth. It was a talent draft, but for empire, not sports. Parents begged, some bribed, some cut off their sons' fingers or blinded them in one eye, because a maimed son at home was better than a perfect one, stolen forever. Imagine standing at your front door as a uniformed man demands your child, not for schooling, not for national service, but forever. Imagine knowing they'll never come home, unless it's years later wearing a uniform, sword in hand, ready to take someone else's son, because that happened. Children taken would return, reprogrammed, leading the next generation of abductions, a cycle perfected. One such boy was Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, taken at age 10 from his Serbian Orthodox family. He would rise to become Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the empire. He ordered raids on the very lands that birthed him. And when he built a bridge in his hometown, historians argue whether it was nostalgia or strategic utility. The truth? It served conquest. His gift was a bridge that helped soldiers return to take more boys. But this wasn't limited to one tragic case. In the registers of 1603 alone, hundreds of names appear, each with a birthplace, each with a new identity forced upon them. Scholars have studied these defter records, cold, detailed, and devastating. This was the machinery of empire, a bureaucracy of erasure. Today you worry if your child doesn't text you back within an hour. Now imagine a regime that comes for your 12-year-old, and you never see them again. That's not ancient legend. That was Balkan reality for over 300 years. And yet, go through any modern university history syllabus. You'll find course after course on the Atlantic slave trade, rightly so. But search for Islamic slavery, Ottoman Devshirme, or child levies, and you'll be lucky to find a footnote. At the top 50 universities in the United States, there are over 300 courses on Atlantic slavery. On Devshirme, fewer than 3. And those few, electives, quietly discouraged, rarely run. Strange, isn't it? How something so vast, so brutal, and so thoroughly documented can vanish from education. Why is this erased while other horrors are studied, remembered, and memorialized? Because this horror leaves no descendants, no diaspora to tell the stories, no living communities shaped by survival. Devshirme was designed not just to enslave, but to assimilate and erase, to produce loyal administrators and soldiers with no memory of who they once were. It was erasure, wrapped in promotion. This wasn't some fringe program. It was the beating heart of an empire, fueling its bureaucracy, expanding its military, and enabling centuries of conquest. It was codified in law, enforced by officials, and applauded by court historians. And yet, it's not in your history books. You weren't taught to look here. That's not an accident. This is only the beginning. In Part 2, we'll peel back the next layer, how these children became products, how mutilation became an industry, how empire calculated death into its profit margins. Because when the human body becomes inventory, horror reaches industrial scale. But wait, it's about to get worse. Part 2. The Machinery of Destruction. They were taken as children, but what came next wasn't just erasure, it was transformation by force. Not into citizens, not into scholars, into instruments. The Ottoman state didn't just abduct boys, it processed them, systematically, into products of empire. Every name erased, every faith overwritten, every language ripped from their tongues. And then, for some, came the knife. This wasn't a punishment. This wasn't symbolic. It was a business. Across the empire, a new kind of slave began to emerge. Silent, obedient, and mutilated. Eunuchs. Their bodies cut, their futures sealed. Not to reform them, to repurpose them. It began in places few modern maps remember. Outposts at the edge of deserts. Border towns where boys were loaded into caravans, forced to walk hundreds of miles without knowing why. Many didn't survive the march. Those who did faced something worse. Imagine a stone chamber, no medical tools, no anesthetic. Just blades, fire, and prayers the boy couldn't understand. The operation was crude. The pain was unimaginable. Most died from bleeding, infection, or shock. But those who lived, those were now worth 3 times their price. The empire had no interest in safe survival. The opposite, in fact. High death rates meant higher demand. Survivors were rare, obedient, and deeply broken. The fewer survived, the more valuable they became. This was not some hidden atrocity. It was open commerce. Slave caravans accounted for the expected death tolls. Traders added it into their ledgers like shipping losses. 3,000 boys purchased, 2,000 dead, 1,000 sold. Profit. Excellent. Behind this trade wasn't only cruelty, it was policy. Religious loopholes permitted the practice as long as others did the cutting. Bureaucrats turned a blind eye. Judges argued it wasn't their responsibility. And the empire grew fat on mutilated backs. The survivors were not sent to labor fields. They were placed in palaces. At the heart of Ottoman power, Topkapi Palace, over 1,000 eunuchs served during its peak. They guarded the Sultan's private chambers, oversaw the harem, relayed orders, monitored wives and concubines. In many ways, they ran the empire's inner world. But make no mistake, they were not equals. They were not honored. They were used. Their status did not protect them from being discarded. When they outlived their use, they were replaced, just like inventory. Some rose through the ranks. A few became powerful. But most died unnamed, unmourned, buried without lineage or legacy. That was the design. They could not father children. They could not form families. They could not threaten the throne. They were safe, but not because they were trusted, because they were broken. And it wasn't just Africa. It wasn't just foreign wars. Boys from the Balkans, Caucasus, and even Central Asia were funneled into this machinery. If they were young, healthy, and unlucky, they might survive the knife. And if they survived, they would serve until death, in velvet halls with no voice, no past, no escape. The system worked because it was perfected over centuries. It was profitable, reliable, and invisible. Today, we struggle to imagine this. We protest for medical rights, for bodily autonomy, for dignity. But this system viewed the human body as raw material. What was cut, what was sold, what was preserved, it all came down to margins. The empire didn't just tolerate this horror, it counted on it. Even more chilling. This wasn't a crime. This was legal. No prison held the perpetrators. No court tried the surgeons. No sultan ever apologized. In fact, they sent purchase orders. If a boy cried during the procedure, he was gagged. If he died, he was buried in mass graves behind the markets. Bones stacked like unwanted merchandise. The ones who survived were renamed, dressed, drilled, reassigned. Their silence wasn't just because of trauma, it was required. They weren't allowed to speak their old languages. They weren't allowed to grieve. The past had no value. Only service did. The genius of the system wasn't in how brutal it was in how well it was hidden. The empire didn't need whips. It used bureaucracy. It didn't burn towns. It erased names. The ultimate conquest wasn't military, it was anatomical. Imagine being so thoroughly redesigned that you can't even remember your mother tongue, that even your voice sounds alien to you, that your body no longer belongs to you and never will again. This is not a metaphor. This was the fate of thousands, millions, over centuries. What does that say about the civilization that built itself on these broken bodies? What does it say about the silence that followed? Because here's the most terrifying part. No monuments mark their graves. No museums bear their names. Their stories are not in your textbooks. Their pain, their lives, their deaths were optimized out of history. And yet, the records remain. The ledgers, the palace logs, the slave market receipts, they are not myths, they were men, or once were. Next, we follow the path of another invisible class, the women, the concubines, the slaves of beauty and violence. Because if the empire could turn boys into silence, it turned girls into currency, and their price was far worse. Part 3. The Market of Flesh. If the empire had a policy for boys, break them, reprogram them, use them, then what it did to girls was worse. Because for girls, there was no education, no military corps, no illusion of merit. There was only value, measured by skin, age, virginity, ethnicity, and silence. Across the Ottoman world, and far beyond, there thrived a system so vast, so routine, and so deeply normalized that even its victims rarely left testimony. They weren't allowed to, because they weren't seen as people. They were inventory, and their pain was profitable. It began at the ports. Kaffa, on the Crimean coast, was the hub. Ships came in carrying grain, fur, iron, and girls. Slavic, Circassian, Georgian, Abyssinian, names the markets memorized better than their buyers. Each year, tens of thousands were processed. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's how many the ledgers show. The process was methodical. Upon arrival, girls were stripped and inspected, not by doctors, by merchants. They examined teeth, skin, posture. Any flaw lowered the price. Too old? Too young? Scarred? Too dark? Too bold? There were price tiers for everything. Circassians fetched the highest sums. Slavic girls closed behind. Nubians and East Africans were marked for domestic use, a euphemism that hid layers of abuse. They were divided into two main markets, harem grade and domestic grade. The difference? One served in luxury and silence, the other in labor and silence, but both served. Inside the Topkapi Palace alone, more than 2,000 women were kept at peak capacity. They were labeled not by name but by category. The concubines, the entertainers, the bath attendants, the intact girls. The records exist: inventory lists, purchase orders, training logs, documents filled out by scribes who probably never asked a single woman her real name. Once purchased, they were renamed. That was the first step of ownership. Next came grooming. Turkish language, Islamic instruction, household behavior, and then obedience. The prettier ones were trained to serve the elite. The rest were distributed to the households of the rich, the powerful, the politically favored. Some were gifted to foreign dignitaries. Some were traded between emirs like currency. A few were even returned, broken, pregnant, or rebellious. The walls of these harems were not silent. They echoed with screams, whispers, and forced laughter. But no one heard them, or chose not to. There are no first-hand memoirs from harem women, not because they didn't exist, but because survival required forgetting. Speaking meant punishment. Writing meant death. And even if they escaped, what society would listen to a woman who came from a palace in chains? The rare exceptions, ambassadors' letters, intercepted correspondence, reveal horror just beneath the velvet. Girls who resisted were whipped, starved, or sold again. Girls who became pregnant without permission were killed quietly, discreetly. Others killed themselves. Suicide inside harems was common, but always written off as melancholy or weak nerves. The palace kept no official death toll. Why would they? These weren't subjects, they were property. Even children weren't safe. When slave women bore sons, those boys could rise if acknowledged by their father. If not, they were discarded. Daughters born in harems often followed their mother's path, trained, sold, renamed. A cycle not of poverty, but of programmed possession. Imagine this. You're 13. You're taken from your family, your name stripped, your body priced. A man 10 times your age owns you. You bear him children, but they aren't yours. They belong to his lineage, his empire. And you? You belong to silence. This wasn't ancient cruelty. This was organized infrastructure. Slave raids into Circassia became so frequent that villages began scarring their daughters intentionally, slashing cheeks, burning faces, just to make them undesirable. Parents mutilated their own children to save them from rape. Let that sink in. One folk song from the North Caucasus carries the lyrics, "Forgive the scar, my daughter. Better ugly and breathing than beautiful and gone." A lullaby turned survival manual. The harem wasn't a fantasy. It was a machine. It was a system perfected over centuries. And it wasn't unique to the Ottomans. Other empires, the Mamluks, the Safavids, the Abbasids, ran similar systems. From North Africa to Central Asia to the Arabian Peninsula, women were bought, sold, rotated, replaced. And like with the boys, this horror was entirely legal, not tolerated, codified. Religious rulings permitted concubinage. Slave girls could be raped by their masters without penalty. Their consent was irrelevant. Their children belonged to the father. Their freedom was a theoretical reward, granted at whim or death. The markets even kept receipts, price lists, verification of virginity, age brackets. One record simply reads, "Girl Georgian 15 healthy. No defects, 500 axi. No name, no story, just attributes." Today you'll find books praising Ottoman architecture, cuisine, tolerance. You'll find documentaries about harems filled with romantic illusions, silks, songs, intrigue. But you won't find many mentions of the screams, or the scars, or the mothers who never got to hold their daughters again. There are no monuments for them, no remembrances, no apology. Their stories were sold off, one by one, until nothing remained. Because this system didn't just consume bodies, it devoured memory. And yet this was still not the worst. In the next chapter, we uncover the weapon that was more devastating than slavery itself, the mathematics of extinction, a system of economic war that didn't need violence to destroy you. It only needed to count you. Because when oppression becomes arithmetic, the soul dies long before the body does. Part 4. The Economics of Erasure. What if I told you that empires don't always need swords to destroy a civilization? Sometimes all it takes is math. Forget the raids. Forget the chains. The most devastating weapon in the arsenal of empire was not steel. It was the ledger, the tax code, the calculated bureaucratic extraction of life. It was called the jizya and the kharaj, two simple words that crushed entire civilizations under their weight. For centuries, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Hindus, Buddhists, all non-Muslims living under Islamic rule, were subject to special taxation. Officially, the jizya was a protection tax. In practice, it was economic strangulation. The kharaj was a land tax, but when applied to non-Muslims, it could reach 70 to 90% of total agricultural output. Imagine working an entire year, harvesting your fields, only to watch uniformed men take nearly everything you produced. And if you couldn't pay, your land was confiscated, your family evicted, sometimes your children taken as compensation. This wasn't a one-time horror. It was annual, systemic, legal. The idea was simple: make survival mathematically impossible and force people into a single option: conversion. One Coptic Christian farmer in 10th century Egypt recorded in his diary, "We harvested 100 sacks. The officials took 85. From the rest, we fed the children. There was nothing left for seed." He buried 3 of his children that winter, not from plague, not from war, from tax policy. The empire didn't need to burn churches or outlaw languages. All it had to do was make it too expensive to stay faithful. And it worked. Slowly, mechanically, like a noose tightening over generations. At first, families scraped by. Then they stopped repairing their homes. Then they pulled their daughters from school. Then came the unthinkable decision: the eldest son would convert to Islam. Not for faith, for survival. With that conversion, the family's tax burden dropped from 80% to 20%. Overnight they could eat. But the son, now a Muslim, could no longer legally inherit from his Christian parents. Upon their death, the land would be seized, redistributed, or absorbed into Muslim hands. Survival today, erasure tomorrow. That wasn't a side effect, that was the point. Now imagine this scenario repeated village after village, generation after generation. The slow bleed, the quiet collapse, no armies, no fires, just numbers on parchment, and the disappearance of a people. But the cruelty didn't stop at your pocket. In Damascus and other cities, the jizya wasn't just collected, it was performed. Non-Muslims had to approach the tax official on their knees. They were slapped on the neck as they paid, a symbolic gesture of subjugation. Fathers practiced not flinching, because if they cried out in front of their sons, it would break them both. One man wrote, "Today I paid the jizya. My son watched. I saw the moment he decided he would not endure what I have." The policy wasn't just economic, it was psychological warfare. In the Armenian village of Kebed, local leaders begged the regional governor to lower the tax rate. It had climbed to 90%. The response? Convert or starve. When the villagers resisted, soldiers came. 10% of the men were executed, children were taken. The rest faced 95% taxation the following year. Within 5 years, the village was gone. No war, just numbers. The records survive. Kebed, population 500, 1560, population 50, 1565, village no longer productive. Recommendation, resettlement. This wasn't random, it was policy. And the effect? Whole cultures disappeared. Zoroastrianism, once the religion of empires, reduced to a remnant community. Buddhist monasteries across Central Asia abandoned, starved, erased. Christian cities emptied. Languages like Coptic, descended from the speech of the pharaohs, vanished. Not because of fire, because of formulas. If you think this was the work of a single tyrant, think again. This system lasted centuries, across empires, borders, and dynasties. It was handed down, normalized, taught. It was the business of extinction, and it wasn't just taxes on land and religion. There were hundreds of micro-taxes. Want to travel between towns? Pay. Want to sell at the market? Pay. Want to fix your church roof after a storm? Pay. Want to bury your dead near the village? Pay. One tax collector wrote in a report, "Dead children reduce future income, reassess land value." To the state, death wasn't tragedy, it was a change in revenue projection. The effect on generational wealth was catastrophic. Muslim families could build and pass on assets. Non-Muslims, their wealth was taxed to death. If a Christian man died, and his son remained Christian, inheritance taxes often consumed the entire estate. If the son had converted, he was ineligible to inherit. Either way, the family lost everything. This was extinction by compound interest, except instead of your wealth growing, your identity vanished. Some communities tried to fight back, not with weapons, but with strategies. They hid wealth, created complex family trusts, pretended conversions, but the empire adjusted. Each loophole was closed. Every act of resistance recorded. The noose pulled tighter. Eventually, even memories faded. Children grew up not knowing the stories of their ancestors. Entire cities transitioned to Islam, not through persuasion, but through fiscal impossibility. No wonder so few descendants remain to tell the tale. And yet, modern narratives still describe these centuries as tolerant, coexistent, even golden. They point to the few protected communities. They forget the majority who were erased, not violently, but methodically. So when you wonder how civilizations disappear, how languages die, how religions fade, how memory crumbles, know that sometimes all it takes is a balance sheet and enough time. But the most terrifying part? No one remembers who authorized it. No one takes credit because the math killed quietly. And the silence that followed? That was the cleanest cut of all. Next, we'll explore the final chapter in this machine of oblivion. How memory itself was targeted. Not just the people, not just their wealth, but their entire cultural identity. Books burned, temples leveled, languages outlawed. A genocide not just of bodies, but of thought. And it worked. Part 5. The murder of memory. There's one kind of death we rarely talk about. A death that leaves no body, no blood, no smoke. The death of memory. You see, empires don't just conquer land. They conquer the past. Because if you can erase what people remember, if you can burn their books, silence their prayers, outlaw their language, you haven't just won the war. You've killed the very idea that resistance was ever possible. And no machine of erasure was more precise, more devastating, than the one perfected across centuries of Islamic imperial expansion. It began with fire. In 1193, invaders reached Nalanda, a Buddhist university in what is now India. It had stood for over 700 years, housed more than 9 million manuscripts, and attracted scholars from as far as China and Persia. When the torches came, they burned for months. So many books, so many lives, all gone in a plume of smoke. The monks were slaughtered where they stood, not in battle, in meditation. The message was clear. Knowledge is not neutral. And if your knowledge doesn't serve the conqueror, it dies. This pattern repeated from Central Asia to North Africa. Zoroastrian fire temples, some burning continuously for over 1,000 years, were extinguished by force, not as casualties of war, but ritually, methodically. Priests were lined up and given a choice, convert or die. Many chose death, the rest, silence. Their sacred texts, written in Avestan, a language older than Greek, were burned or buried. Today what remains are fragments, pages, verses. Reconstructed not from living tradition, but from ruins. Imagine if Christianity survived only through a few scraps of Latin found in a basement. That's the scale of loss we're talking about. Then came the temples. From Persia to India, thousands of Hindu and Jain temples were razed. Not repurposed, erased. Stones torn down, idols smashed, libraries looted. Sometimes the very foundations were dug up and replaced with mosques. And when they didn't destroy them, they converted them. Imagine seeing the place your ancestors worshipped turned into the headquarters of the ideology that destroyed them. The sacred floors, now a place you're forbidden to enter. This wasn't just conquest. It was humiliation engineered into architecture. The Bamyan Buddhas stood for over 1,500 years in what is now Afghanistan, until they were destroyed in 2001. But that act wasn't new. It was a continuation. The same region, centuries earlier, had seen monasteries emptied, scriptures burned, statues defaced. The Buddhas survived as long as they did only because they were too big to move, too beautiful to ignore. Eventually, even that wasn't enough. But you don't need to burn books to kill a culture. Sometimes all you have to do is make its language illegal. Take Coptic, the final evolution of the language of ancient Egypt. It descended from the speech of pharaohs, refined through the centuries, then written in Greek script with unique characters. At first it survived in churches, then in homes, then only in whispers. Arabic replaced it in government, then in markets, then in streets. Over generations, Coptic retreated into prayer, then into memory, then into nothing. The last native speaker died sometime in the 1600s. A language spoken since before the pyramids? Gone. The empire didn't need to ban it explicitly. It simply made it unviable. Children spoke Arabic to survive. Their children forgot Coptic ever existed. This wasn't a rare event. It was a model. It happened in Persia, in Anatolia, in the Levant. Language after language, culture after culture, erased not by violence alone, but by calculated irrelevance. If you can't speak your mother tongue in court, or in the market, or to your children, how long before it disappears? Some tried to resist. They kept oral traditions. They wrote in code. They buried their books beneath floorboards. But time is relentless. Oppression, when patient, always wins. There are no libraries cataloging what was lost. How could there be? We don't even know the names of the languages that disappeared, the philosophies that never got translated, the songs no one recorded, the stories that died when the last speaker took their final breath. When we say lost civilizations, we imagine Atlantis, Maya ruins in the jungle. But these weren't lost by accident. They were deleted, actively, systematically. One historian called it genocide by silence, and the silence worked. Today, people walk through cities built atop the bones of forgotten faiths and don't even realize it. Mosques that were once churches, courthouses built over temples, languages replaced so thoroughly they seem like they never existed. Ask yourself this: how much would need to be erased from your culture, your history, before your descendants forget you ever lived? Now multiply that by millions. And here's the most brutal truth. The people who did this thought they were doing the world a favor. They called it reform, renewal, enlightenment. They believed they were saving souls, cleansing idolatry, bringing order. But what they were really doing was wiping out memory so completely, the victims wouldn't even know what they'd lost. And it worked, because we're not mourning these cultures. We don't even know enough to miss them. No parades, no candles, no days of remembrance, just silence. This is what real conquest looks like. Not the clash of armies, but the slow, systematic deletion of identity. When your temples fall, your books burn, your names are changed, and your language dies. So do you, not in body, but in history. And here's the terrifying part. All of this was just the setup, because after the people were taken, the bodies broken, the memory destroyed, there was one thing left to conquer: the future. In the next part, we confront the final horror, the perfect crime, the disappearance of legacy itself, how entire populations were consumed so completely that they left no children, no graves, no names. Because the most terrifying erasure is the one where no one remains to remember you ever existed. Part 6. The theft of the future. By now you've seen the pattern. First, the children were taken. Then, the bodies broken. Then, the memories burned. But there was still one last thing to steal: the future. Because the greatest conquest is not over the living, but over those who never get the chance to live at all. You see, most genocides leave graves, mass burials, photos, bullet casings. There's something left, something that says, we were here. But there's another kind of genocide, one that leaves no bones, no screams, no ash. It leaves silence, and silence doesn't bury the past. It buries the possibility of a future. It begins with the sterilization of men, not one by one, but by design. The castration of millions wasn't just a punishment. It was a policy. The eunuch didn't just lose his manhood, he lost the right to father, to build a bloodline, to leave anything behind. What's the word for a man with no past, no present, and no legacy? The empire didn't want fathers, it wanted tools. Every time a boy was cut, a family tree was snapped at the root. There would be no grandchildren, no family name, no cultural continuity. The wound wasn't just physical, it was genealogical. And this went beyond biology. The children born of female slaves, concubines, harems, sexual captives, were not raised in their mother's faith or language or values. They were raised by the state, programmed, repurposed, detached from half of their heritage by law. There was no hybrid identity, no coexistence. The past was amputated. The future, redirected. Imagine this. Your daughter is stolen, raped, forced to bear children for a man who bought her. Her child is not hers. Her culture dies with her, her name forgotten. And even her descendants, if they survive, will never know where they came from. Now multiply that by centuries. This isn't cultural integration. This is annihilation through absorption. And even when families survived in name, their futures were choked off in other ways. In many places, non-Muslims could not own new land. They could not build new houses. They could not inherit freely. Their professions were restricted. Their rights in court diminished. Over time, the message was simple. You are not meant to flourish here. This didn't spark overnight rebellion. It sparked something worse. Surrender. Villages slowly emptied. Families dwindled. Birth rates dropped. Youth left for distant cities. Some converted. Others vanished. Community structures collapsed. A people once thriving became minorities. Then fragments. Then histories. We mourn extinction when it's sudden. When a forest burns, when a species disappears in a decade. But what if it takes 300 years? Is it still tragedy, or does it become forgettable? The empire preferred forgettable. And when extinction didn't happen fast enough, it was helped along. During periods of upheaval, entire populations were relocated, a polite word for ethnic cleansing. Villages with thousands of years of tradition were emptied in days. Churches became storage rooms. Cemeteries turned into foundations for schools. Names of towns changed. Street signs replaced. The past paved over. If no one speaks your name, if no one lights a candle where your ancestors are buried, did you ever really exist? This was not a glitch in history. It was its strategy. Because empires know something most people forget. The ultimate victory isn't in killing your enemies. It's in making sure their grandchildren don't remember them at all. One Armenian proverb says, "A people dies when its last child forgets the name of the first," and that forgetting was engineered. The education system taught children a version of history where their ancestors were enemies, where their own culture was an error, where survival meant assimilation and silence. Even language became a trap. Children growing up Christian and Muslim-majority lands often didn't learn to read their own sacred texts. Arabic became the tongue of opportunity. Their mother tongue? A secret whispered only at home and often, not even there. By the third generation, it was gone. And it didn't stop there. There were laws forbidding the public display of non-Muslim religious symbols, restrictions on the ringing of bells, bans on procession, no crosses, no chants, no signs that a different culture had once stood here. The cities looked uniform, peaceful. But that peace was bought with extinction. So by the time modernity arrived, by the time cameras, documents, and press freedom existed, most of the damage was done. The people weren't just dead, they were replaced. The stories weren't just forgotten, they were rewritten. And so today, tourists walk through beautiful cities filled with domes, markets, courtyards, never realizing the ground beneath their feet holds the bones of civilizations erased. The silence isn't natural, it was manufactured. So what do we do now? We live in an era of information, of remembrance, of access. But if the voices are still missing, still silenced, then what good is knowledge? Because if empires could steal childhood, mutilate bodies, erase languages, kill memory, and sterilize futures, and the world barely blinked, what else have they done that we don't yet know? And what might still be happening today? Because this wasn't just history, it was a formula, a system, a blueprint. And blueprints don't vanish, they evolve. In the final part of this series, we'll ask the only question left. If they could erase all of this, what else have they erased? Part 7. The Hidden Ledger. Here we are. The final page, the final breath. We've journeyed through blood taxes and burnt books. We've stood in silence among vanished villages and beneath ruined temples. We've listened to the voices of those who could never speak. And now one question remains. If they could erase all of this, what else have they erased? Because history isn't just what happened, it's what we're allowed to remember. Let's be clear, the truth was never entirely lost. It was just filed away, tucked inside archives, written in languages you were never taught, locked behind gatekeepers who decided which parts of the past deserved to be told. The blood tax, it's there, in official Ottoman registers. The castrations, medical journals, missionary records. The market prices of women and children, in ledgers. The temple burnings, in travel diaries. The tax ledger genocides, court transcripts, economic surveys. The murdered languages, linguistic atlases. The ghost towns, still visible on satellite maps. All of it recorded, all of it cataloged. So ask yourself, why weren't you told? Why do school books celebrate architectural brilliance but skip over the screams that echoed in those same stone walls? Why do college courses mention coexistence but never the cost paid by the coexisting? Why do museums praise Islamic calligraphy but never display the shattered scripts of those who were forbidden to write? Because the greatest erasure wasn't the burning of books, it was the burning of curiosity. The world was trained to look away, to flinch at some atrocities, but politely ignore others, to mourn some genocides, but label others as historical nuance, to remember slavery, but not this slavery. And when the victims themselves are gone, no children, no memorials, no commemorative days, the world sighs in relief. No one left to raise a hand and say, "What about us?" That silence becomes permission. That absence becomes a blank page. And that blank page, it gets rewritten. So today, when you visit Istanbul, you'll be shown the grandeur of the Blue Mosque, but no one will mention the boys buried beneath its rise. When you eat Persian sweets, you won't hear about the Zoroastrian priests who starved in tax debt. When you read poetry from Andalusia, no one tells you how many Jewish mothers bartered their children to escape conversion. And when you scroll past stunning palaces from Delhi to Cairo, you won't see the invisible fingerprints of those who built them in chains. Because that's how the ledger works. It records what was profitable. It hides what was necessary to forget. And we, you and I, were born into that silence. But now you've seen it, and you can't unsee it. The legacy of empire is not just marble and minarets. It's bones, and shadows, and blank space where stories should have been. So what do? We begin by asking, relentlessly. We dig, we challenge, we refuse to settle for the curated version of history. We read the margins, we find the footnotes, we learn the forbidden words. We tell the stories that were never meant to survive. Because memory is rebellion, and truth is sacred. This isn't about blame. It's about honesty. It's about saying we deserve to know the whole story, not to hate, but to heal. Because silence isn't neutral. It protects the systems that made it. And if we refuse to fill that silence with truth, then we are complicit in its continuation. So here's the truth. Empires rise. Empires fall. But their shadows remain. And some shadows stretch across centuries, into textbooks, into politics, into how we see ourselves. This series wasn't about the past. It was about what the past allows in the present. Because if they could erase so many children, so many families, so many languages, so many futures, then what else right now is being erased? Somewhere today, a child is being taught a version of history where none of this happened. Somewhere a textbook is being printed that calls conquest civilization. Somewhere a mother tells her child to hide their heritage just to survive. Somewhere an archive holds the truth but the door stays locked. And the longer we let that stand, the more likely we become part of the erasure. So ask the question they fear most. If they could hide this, what are they hiding now? And when you ask, don't whisper. Say it loud. Because silence built this tragedy, and only truth can break it.